Okay, today we'll be talking about energy and transportation system models. Kind of the theme of the class is we're getting sort of bigger and bigger in terms of what we're modeling here. Okay, so this is kind of in the course title. So who can tell me what a system model is? Any ideas? Any guesses? You guys are all in this class, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, what does that mean? I guess what is a system? So this is a set of things kind of working together as part of a sort of holistic mechanism or some kind of interconnected network. And I think it really helps to think of these models this way because you can kind of break things out into digestible parts. And so we'll see as we go through a bunch of examples today of different system models. By having these sort of modules, it's easier to understand each of the components, especially since we've been covering, I think, a lot of the central building blocks of these things. So it's pretty broad and can cover a large number of topics. As a field, inherently, sort of energy and these days transportation has become a lot more sort of interdisciplinary. So we don't think of just approaches strictly from, say, an engineering standpoint or an economic standpoint. You have to think sort of interdisciplinary and across different sectors. So these are types of things that go into and also things that we try to get out of these system models. So building a system model, probably the most important thing is to sort of consider the objective of your study. There are lots of different models that you can use, different approaches that can be taken, but you should always try and keep in mind and focus the sort of construction of your model to ultimately get to the outcome that you care about. What are the components needed to determine your model? Again, just trying to make it a little bit more digestible. Is it going to be some kind of input data versus modeled data? What sort of techniques are you going to be employing out of the sort of suite of things that we've talked about so far in class? Which ones kind of make sense to apply in a particular type of model versus another one? We've gone through this discussion about simplicity versus complexity. Making a more complex model to look at a specific thing could be necessary, right? But that depends on ultimately the objective of your study. And so really the point of doing this modeling, right, is to figure out the best way to kind of use your resources and construct this model. Okay. So the first bit of today's lecture is we're going to look at a whole suite of examples of some sector-specific models, either in transportation or in energy in like the power sector. And the idea here is we want to kind of expose you guys to a whole set of different models that may or may not be relevant to your research, but also to help connect the dots of all the sort of modeling techniques that we've talked about so far in this class and how they're ultimately getting applied in the real world. And this may also hopefully serve as maybe some kind of inspiration on models that you might want to construct. Okay, so we're going to go through a whole bunch of these things right now. Some of these are going to be well, okay, we'll see in just a moment. So the first one we'll talk about is the EV toolbox, the electric vehicle toolbox. So this is a model. It's been developed and continues to be developed for many years now. And that's one of these in-house models at UC Davis at the Plug-in Hybrid and Electric Vehicle Center. It used to be developed in ArcGIS. Now the platform is in R. And the objective of this model, right, as I was saying, it's important to have this kind of in the forefront, is how you can deploy electric vehicle infrastructure to meet EV demand. Okay, and so here, this is kind of a network scheme to break down the essential components of this model. So the first idea is, okay, if I want to figure out where chargers need to be, I first need to know where the electric vehicles are located, right? And so who owns electric vehicles? So the first half of this model is this big sort of adoption forecast model that does actually rely on some of the forecasting tools that I talked about earlier in this course, and we'll get more specific in a second. But it takes determinants of things like housing and income, and then this idea called neighborhood effects, which is like if you see a bunch of your neighbors owning electric vehicles, there's a higher likelihood that people in that neighborhood will have a proclivity towards buying those new technologies. And the idea is like, oh, they're not such a sort of foreign technology anymore. I see other people that I know driving them, and that may sort of influence your purchasing behavior. So using these determinants, and there's a couple other factors, but these are the main ones that go into this, you can kind of see as more and more people buy electric vehicles, where they're going to be located in the state. Okay, and then to understand where they charge, you have to know, just because a person has an EV and they live in this area doesn't mean that that's necessarily where they're going to be charging, right? So you might expect that they might drive somewhere else to go to work, they might drive somewhere else to go grocery shopping, and so on and so forth. So having an idea of the commute routes, that's kind of an input to ultimately get at what you need here. And then you need some ideas about attributes of the charging infrastructure, like the charging speed, and then ideas about how much it's going to cost. And these play into the decision making for not only where you would install them, but also where the EV drivers are likely to charge. So in this first part, as I was saying, is the determinants. So this is built off of some stuff that we've already talked about. So this is a regression and a Bass diffusion model. So the regression component looks at these two things about housing and income, so demographic characteristics, and then levels of adoption at neighboring regions. That's the neighborhood effect. So they look at all of the blocks sort of adjacent to where electric vehicles are owned. And then the sort of overall growth curve in any individual area is determined by this Bass diffusion model, right? So this is that S-shaped diffusion curve. So by combining these two things together, they're employing these techniques to develop this first half of the model. In the second half, this is the travel behavior part. They have high resolution data about mapping origin destination between home and work locations. You can actually get this from tax data. I think they were using like W2 data to determine the sort of general area of where the houses are and the general area of where the workplace locations are. And then you get an idea, a pretty good idea of what the commute routes and distances look like. And then we can simulate the charging patterns by bootstrapping empirical data, right? And so this is a technique that we've talked about. This is kind of analogous to Monte Carlo, except you know the input distributions. Yeah, so any questions about this model? Yes. Sure. Yeah, so as a reminder, these are the three main parameters in the Bass diffusion model. P and Q are indicators for, so the way the Bass diffusion model works, right, is there's two sort of generalized sets of populations. What are they called again? There's there's a specific term. I think it's like innovators and what's the other one? It's like followers. Yeah. So I'm gonna get this backwards, aren't I? I think P is the innovators, Q is the followers, and these coefficients, if you modify them, it changes the shape of the curve essentially. M is the potential adopters. So it's like the highest threshold you could get. So this is, so in this model, the way they determine that, which you know, there's some disagreements about how this is done, but the idea is like, what's the most number of people who could adopt an electric vehicle? And they did this by looking at the proportion of total car owners in California who own, who have the ability to charge at home. So it's mostly like single family households that have access to like a driveway or garage. And there are some other modifications to that number to allow it to, you know, maybe take a certain proportion of the rest of the people who actually have some ability to charge if they're parking in like parking garages and that sort of thing. So that's how they determine this M number. I mean, that potentially could be different in the future. Yeah. So good question. So there, you can imagine that there are a lot of other determinants related to, you know, purchasing of an electric vehicle that may have to do with, for example, the price of the vehicle or, you know, other incentives, right? Like access to HOV lanes. So those are inherently kind of captured in these P and Q values because we calibrate P and Q to real sales data, right? So if I draw a curve here, and so this is time and volume of vehicles sold. So the way it works is you have some kind of curve like this, and this is what we can see from historical data. Let's say this is going out to like 2020. Okay, and then from here, I can calibrate P, Q, and M based off just what I see here. And then you can extrapolate outwards on what the rest of the curve looks like. So the thing is, Um, these are meant to capture generically all the sort of determinants of why someone would want to buy a car. And in this portion here, right, electric vehicles already have incentives. So those would inherently get captured in your PQ and M. Things start to get a little fuzzy, right? Because if you say the incentives goes away or something in the future, now probably the curve would change a little bit. So there are more complex versions of the Bass diffusion model where you can include more generalized parameters, so you could explicitly control for something like a vehicle price. But that's not how it's done, at least in this model. Yeah. Yes.
So on the right side, you said you have demographic characteristics.
Yes.
And here you only include housing plus income. So I wonder, like, what are the variables?
So they include a whole bunch of other demographic characteristics, but from the regression, these are the ones that tend to look like they're, yeah, influencing the model. Yeah. It's the other variables included are the suite of like typical things that you would include for demographics. So age, education, like gender breakdown. What else is in there? I think they have like race in there. Yeah, but these ones tend to do the best in terms of explaining. Yeah, so there's a public version that's available, so anyone here is able to use them, and that one was developed specifically for California. We do work with some other stakeholders around the country to help develop the analogous toolbox for them. So this has been used in other places, like on the East Coast. Yeah. Did you have a question? Oh, yes, no problem. That's why I'm here. All right. So the next one, this is actually also a similar type of tool looking at EV infrastructure deployment. Sorry, you guys get to hear a lot about electric vehicles all the time because that's what I do my work in. So that's what I'm familiar with. So this is developed at NREL. So that's the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. It's one of the national labs over in Golden, Colorado. The EVI Pro 1.0 platform was in MATLAB, and then the 2.0 was ported over to Python. There are sort of small like light versions that are publicly available. But if you want the sort of full version, it's not so hard to get. Same thing here, objective is to look at EV infrastructure deployments. The approach is actually quite a bit different. In some ways, fundamentally, it's going to need similar types of information, but they generate it fairly differently. So this is a schematic of the model. So you can see the sort of these network diagrams, again, that I was mentioning. So they focus on the driving and charging simulations, the vehicle attributes, infrastructure attributes, and travel data. So this part, so in the EV toolbox, right, a lot of that travel information was determined by these commute patterns from home to work. This travel information is from these high resolution trip diaries where people are saying, you know, I'm going from home to work to school to, you know, other stores. And so this, I think, relative to the last model, captures probably more thorough travel information, because the other one is just about commute patterns, but there's a lot less data. You can imagine the other one, it's pretty comprehensive in terms of being able to get almost the entire population, whereas this is relying on some sort of elicited survey data. So there are trade-offs that you make going between these things. So going through the simulation, it determines like charging load profiles, which is a big thing out of this modeling efforts, individual charging session patterns, and then you can do a bunch of post-processing to essentially figure out where you want to place the charging infrastructure. So one of the big differences is that in the EV toolbox, we were sort of modeling the number of electric vehicles that we'd assume would be happening out into the future, right? That's why we go through this whole regression thing. And then with the fast diffusion model, here you just plug in a number, okay? You just say, let's suppose I'm in a future scenario where there's 10,000 electric vehicles, you know, in this particular area. So this is an exogenous input. And so you can derive these from things like the EIA annual energy outlook, or you can get these from, you know, other models, or you can just make it up yourself. The charging behavior is based on an optimization algorithm. So this deploys infrastructure at minimum cost, subject to some sets of constraints. We haven't sort of really covered optimization per se, but this is a common sort of modeling method. I mean, the reason why we don't get so much into optimization is there's probably too much there. You could take entire sort of courses dedicated to this. So if folks are interested in this sort of technique, I'm happy to chat about it more or give you pointers. And one of the things that you can do, and so this starts getting to larger sort of multi-sector or system models. In this case, I think a lot of this is probably still in transportation, but the sort of EVI Pro box is over here. But this work at a higher level is part of a big push by the Department of Energy to look at you know, some of the technological transitions in transportation. And so there's a bunch of other groups at NREL and even at other national labs that are working on sort of different pieces of this. So adopt MA3T and Tempo, these are all vehicle adoption models. We'll actually talk about MA3T today. And then Polaris, Beam, and Hive, these are agent-based simulations to look at how vehicles are traveling and even charging to some degree. And so you can see how in the DOE's sort of strategic vision for looking at a lot of stuff, there's a big cooperative effort to kind of put a lot of these models together. Okay, any questions about EVI Pro? They have this really nice user interface on their website based on the Lite version. So if you just Google EVI Pro Lite, L-I-T-E, not L-I-G-H-T. I don't know why they spelled it like that, but yeah, you can play around with this tool that has actually a really nice visualization, and it's pretty easy to mess around with. So if you're interested in any of this stuff. Okay, MA3T, which I was just mentioning, this is the market acceptance of advanced automotive technologies. So this is designed by Oak Ridge National Laboratory. It's actually a simple sort of Microsoft Excel based platform, and this simulates market demand for advanced vehicle technologies. So you can think of this as a lot more sort of detailed version of this thing here. Okay, so this is kind of the network diagram for MA3T. There's a lot sort of going on here, but we'll walk through this for all the important pieces. The main sort of modeling portion is this part right here. So consumer choices. So this is a discrete choice model. And if you're interested in learning about that, Professor David Bunch teaches some nice courses in discrete choice. But the idea is like, if I have car A and car B, and let's say this has price X and fuel efficiency Y, and this has, price A and fuel efficiency B, how do people kind of go about making their decisions to pick a particular choice? That's kind of the whole idea behind these choice models. So what you can do in the consumer choice here is it takes in all of these things about vehicle attributes, energy prices, policy. So this might even be things like incentives for electric vehicles, and then availability of refueling and recharging infrastructure, like how hard is it for me to refuel? How long does it take? So all of these and ultimately end up feeding into your choice model. And it basically tells you, okay, then you can expect to sell certain amounts of EVs. And these will sort of translate into all of these types of outcomes that you can measure over time. So stock, how much energy use is there, what's the sort of social impact. But the main thing is this consumer choice bit here. And there are a lot of sort of feedback mechanisms throughout. So the types of vehicle and component attributes that are important to feed into this choice model, right? To make sure that the consumers and buyers of these vehicles will have all the available data to make their decisions. You include things like prices, fuel efficiency, vehicle range, acceleration, cargo and luggage space, and so on. And then diverse sets of technologies, gasoline, diesel, natural gas, fuel cells, electric vehicles. I think those are the main ones that they look at here. So those all get fed into the sets of attributes that you use for consumer choices. So the way this works is essentially people care about price to some degree, they care about fuel efficiency to some degree, and so on and so forth. And you can use regression techniques to determine how much they care about each of those attributes. And then you can take historical data to calibrate, okay, I observed that like a whole bunch of people, prefer fuel efficiency to some extent compared to like acceleration, right? And I can use those values then to project how they would care about like future types of vehicle models. You have to include all of the prices and attributes for the alternatives, so gasoline, diesel, electricity, and natural gas. And those can be determined in a variety of ways. If you want, you can go into modeling them, or you can just take projections. So again, I'm kind of going back to this annual energy outlook, which is the sort of well-developed set of forecasts by the government, where these projections are sort of readily available. So some of the policies that go in, as I was mentioning, you can have the purchase subsidies, so tax credits. There's also things like battery warranty that folks could care about. Yeah, California is actually doing this thing with ARB to basically try and guarantee these battery warranties to alleviate customer concern over electric vehicle battery degradation. So there actually right now there's a discussion about developing a rule that basically has a guaranteed warranty or a required warranty that automakers have to provide for free. That's if the state of charge of the battery falls below 80% in the first decade, then you get a new battery for free, which is a pretty good guarantee to have. Yeah, so I would say the first three are kind of sets of incentives. There are also policies that may affect the auto industry, which determines the vehicle attributes and component attributes. So things like the fuel economy standards, which is a requirement on fuel efficiency. Those would play into policies that affect the model in a slightly different way. Okay, and so the main output of the choice model is vehicle sales, and then from sales, right, we can track things like the stock of the vehicles, and you could employ a vehicle stock model to complement MA3T to determine sort of overall size of your fleet or proportion of the overall fleet that might be transitioning to a different technology. You can also estimate things like fuel and electricity consumption. So if the objective of your study is to look at like emissions impacts, for example, you could employ this as sort of the front end to determine vehicle volumes, and then use the output of this model as an input to determining some of these factors. Okay, any questions about this model? There's some, so what I'll say about MA3T is there's some kind of unique aspects about how they treat the refueling, recharging infrastructure, and even some of the vehicle attributes. This was kind of novel at the time because it allowed you to make assumptions about what refueling and recharging infrastructure would look like without necessarily having data on that. And the whole purpose of that was to kind of be able to derive models about like hydrogen fuel cell adoption and electric vehicle adoption before there were any vehicles sort of driving around on the road. So this model is actually a little bit older, but lots of people still use it. Okay. So we'll talk about the switch model now. We're getting a slightly different thing now because this is not transportation. This is focused on the electricity grid and the power sector. Originally created at Berkeley. It's built on a Python platform. It's all open source, so anyone can use this. And the idea is looking at planning investments of the electricity grid. So this is what we would traditionally call like a capacity expansion model, although there are variants of this that have been used for a variety of other applications. Okay, so the switch model takes in a whole bunch of different inputs. You have to know a lot about the portfolio of generators. Okay, and so that tells you a lot about things like how they're built, how they're dispatched, whether or not they should be doing unit commitments, which is just basically turning on and off. There are a whole set of information that you need about getting the electricity from point A to point B. So that's in your transmission, energy sources from the generators, what kind of fuels that they're using, and how they accommodate sort of all the fuel costs from the mining, transportation, and going all the way to the generators. On the demand side, it has to think about balancing the load. So what are the zones that you're balancing, and then what are the corresponding electricity demands in any particular zone? And then you can have other sort of constraints, like if you need operating reserves, you know, how much backup power do you need? And then if there's policies, like if you have a renewable portfolio standard that requires like a certain proportion of renewables, so all of this information needs to get fed into this model to determine these things. So thinking about how the sort of markets for electricity works, one of the fundamental operations of this model is to build on a couple operations we covered in class. So financing of a project over its lifetime. So this thinks about, so if you remember, essentially, we do these levelized costs. So levelized cost of energy is equal to the sort of lifetime costs, and then this would be discounted, divided by the energy produced over the lifetime. So this is what makes this type of problem really complicated. When you do capacity expansion, you are deciding whether or not to build a specific power plant. Let's say I'm trying to decide if I should build a natural gas plant or a solar farm. So I have a pretty good idea of what the lifetime costs are going to be, but the energy produced from that depends on the suite of other power plants that are in the system. And so you have to look at this and operate it over the lifetime of the system compared to all these other combinations of possible power plants that you could have, which will be changing this number all the time. And that can have a really big effect on whether or not you decide to build it, right? So you have to do these long multi-year runs to figure out how they operate to get this number and have it compared to all your other possible alternatives. So in the optimization portion of it, it tries to turn on power plants in sort of the cheapest way to meet your load, which is essentially how it works in the real world. But it also has to minimize the cost of building new power plants, which is a fundamentally sort of difficult problem. There are a whole bunch of operational constraints. So things like unit commitment, which will take into account how fast generators can ramp. So a simple example would be, let's say I need 100 units of power all of a sudden in the next, let's say, hour. And then you have, let's say, a natural gas plant and a nuclear plant that are both sort of near zero capacity, and you need to ramp them up to meet the load. Well, the nuclear is cheaper, so normally you would prefer that, but because you need the power in such a short amount of time, a nuclear plant, right, it boils water, it takes a long time to do. So in some cases, you would prefer to turn on a different generator in order to produce that power, because there are physical limitations to the operation of certain plants. So this model will think about things like that. When you turn a generator on and off, it's not like flipping a switch. Oh yeah, go ahead. Yes, yes, they do. So yeah, so hydro has an extension here for a couple of reasons, and I'll talk about that in a second, but um, all of the generators here are actually sort of at an individual generator by generator level. So you have all these attributes about the heat rate, so the efficiency that it converts fuel into electricity. You have information about start up and shut off, which is if it turns off, you can't just turn it back on. It has to cool down for a certain amount of time. It has information about how quickly they can ramp. And then there's all this stuff about the fuel costs that it takes. So the reason why this explicitly breaks out hydro is because hydro is a bit more complicated. Every year there's rainfall, you build up water, and then you can think of it as you have this, this isn't quite how it works, but the way you can think of it is like you have a reservoir to work with in like a given season. And you can go full on for a certain amount of time or a certain amount of energy, right? But then if you use that up, then maybe you have to operate at a sort of lower power output. So there's some weird dynamic things about hydro that they kind of break out explicitly because that fuel is a little bit weird compared to dispatch, like normal dispatchable stuff. Yeah. Okay, so fuel costs, forecasts of energy price is a common theme that we've been seeing, right? EIA, AEO, they use this as well. It's a common sort of input tool for a lot of this, for a lot of these types of models. Okay, any questions about this? So we'll talk about another electricity grid model. This is the good model, the grid optimized operation dispatch. And this is kind of a lot of what I do. I developed this model here at Davis. Its platform is in R, wrapped around a GAMS optimization software. So basically this simulates operation of power plants. So this is known as an economic dispatch model. A lot of the motivation behind this work is to think about applications of how it interacts with the electricity grid. So this is one example of a project that we looked at to see how extreme fast charging, which is the 300 plus kilowatt chargers, would impact the electricity system. So we do all this thing about figuring out what the fleet size is going to look like, and then do a simulation about what the vehicle charging is going to look like. We use a lot of the same techniques that that I've already discussed in some of the earlier vehicle models like EVI Pro, and we determine electricity demand, and then this part then gets fed into the dispatch model. So basically, at the end of the day, what this is able to tell you is like, if I go and like I plug in my electric vehicle, I can actually figure out what power plant in your region is kind of ramping up to meet the charging loads of plugging in that electric vehicle. And you can do this in aggregate and essentially figure out, you know, upstream emissions, because you want to say something like, okay, I know that these power plants are responding to all of these sort of charging events. So yeah, that's kind of the main idea here. Oh, sorry, this is covering the text a little bit. but yeah, so the first part of the charging profiles, we take this from empirical data where we have data from public chargers, data from a variety of other sort of sources about what time of the day people charge. And then we can bootstrap that to figure out what the charging profiles would look like under a set of sort of different scenarios. And this is all from doing bootstrap simulations. We dispatch generators using least cost optimization. And then similar to the switch model, there are physical constraints on all of the generators that we try to take into account, things like ramping ability, heat rates, and then renewable capacity factors. So these are things to make sure that like, just because you have a capacity of like solar installed, it doesn't mean it can be turned on all the time, right? There are limitations based off of your solar availability and wind availability. And the primary output is when power plants turn on and how much power they generate. And the things that we were able to look at: fuel consumption, energy efficiency, cost of electricity. But the big one for this particular project was looking at emissions and sort of health impacts. So we can actually see how CO2 and other pollutants, NOx, SOx, carbon monoxide, H2S, how these things change, every time someone plugs in an electric vehicle. And also we can observe how this changes over time. Like if we say, oh, the grid is actually getting cleaner, right? So in combination with the growth in the charging load, they kind of offset each other, right? Because you're growing your electricity demand, but you're decreasing the dirty power that's generating that electricity. Okay. Models within models. So this was work that we done with a team at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, where we combined this. So I'll maybe quickly describe this project. It's this idea where we want to look at a potential future where everyone is driving in these shared autonomous electric vehicles. So think of like normal private cars, everyone's driving around in Uber and Lyft, and they're all autonomous, so you don't need any drivers, and they're all electric. This topic area of shared autonomous electric vehicles has been somewhat popular in the recent years. There's a lot of innovation in the sort of like ride hailing space. There's a lot of innovation in the autonomous vehicle space, and obviously electric vehicles are taking off. So people have been doing studies about like transitioning into these systems, and we wanted to basically have this look at like, hey, what happens if we just go to the total end of the spectrum and say everyone is using these vehicles? What would it look like? So we have all these interesting findings about like, you can go from 400 million vehicles in the US down to like, was it like 10 million vehicles, and still be able to satisfy everyone's travel demands. So there's interesting things like that in here. But the main idea from this model diagram is that this was like a collaborative multi-team effort where we were able to combine a bunch of sort of different models together. I talked about EBI Pro, I talked about Good. RISE is this model out of UC Berkeley that's looking at ride hail operations specifically. So yeah, so even the development of a sort of complex model can be used as part of a tool in sort of a sort of broader modeling effort. And this is kind of a nice transition to what we're going to talk about now, which is these much broader, large-scale models, which take sort of sector-specific models, which I've been mainly talking about here, right? In either like transportation or in specific aspects of energy. and combining them in a really big sort of interdisciplinary way. So linking, when we think about addressing climate change and a lot of the like modeling efforts that go into this whole sort of world, there's a big link between society and economy and all this like engineering system models that we were talking about to things like biosphere and atmosphere, and combining that into a single framework. So this isn't, we're not going to be talking about the climate change system models specifically, but what we're going to look at now is a lot of these integrated assessment models, which combine a lot of these models that we're talking about, these system models and sectoral specific models that we're talking about, with some of the climate change models, and we can see how they're kind of put together. Obviously interdisciplinary, lots of disciplines here. And this allows us to provide a single framework to assess these things. So when we think about, when the IPCC makes recommendations, like how can you go about doing this when, the world is such a sort of complex system, right? It's a combination of these sort of large scale modeling efforts. So this is, I think, a nice sort of generalized diagram of an integrated assessment model. What things do you want to integrate? So stakeholders, issues, and governance. What aspects of the system do you want to be integrated? So human setting, natural setting, I think this is kind of a little bit weird. Spatial temporal, these should probably be, specific details of the human and natural setting. And a lot of that, well, I would say actually almost everything that we've talked about so far is mainly focused on the human setting. And then methodological aspects. And so, what models and methods are you going to be using here? And how do you integrate uncertainty into those methods? So at a high level, there are essentially two types of integrated assessment models. You have cost-benefit integrated assessment models, and these are mainly tools that are used to calculate the social cost of carbon. So maybe some of you guys have heard of these, DICE, PAGE, FUND. These are all cost benefits models. Then you have process-based integrated assessment models. So these are more complex sets of models that can look at sort of specific influencing factors that could impact your greenhouse gas emissions. So GCAM, message, Morcal/times, and the AIM, just a small subset of integrated assessment models. These models have the sort of weight and support of huge research teams, multiple universities and national labs, not just in the US, but sort of across the world. And these are a lot of what scientists and researchers look to when thinking about impacts of climate change at a systemic level. Okay, so we'll talk about this cost benefit models first. And as I was mentioning, right, so the main things these are trying to determine are looking at social cost of carbon. So we think about CO2 as an externality, right? You may have heard of this in economics. Whatever sort of activity that we're doing that requires energy is probably leading to CO2 emissions at some scale. And those emissions are considered externalities because we don't sort of directly pay for them in any way. And so the social cost of carbon is this idea that we can determine the economic cost of those externalities by looking at climate change damages. Okay, so every time I emit some amount of carbon, there are some climate damages down the line that happen that incur some cost to society. And so we attempt to measure this social cost of carbon. This is a really complex topic. Damages can be really difficult to capture. There are limitations in models that exclude certain types of impacts just because we don't know enough about it, or we don't know how to necessarily value it. So like physical, ecological, and economic impacts. So if if we're talking about CO2 emissions and climate change, and you want to measure all the damages, some of these things are a little bit more straightforward, right? Maybe loss of like agricultural productivity due to climate change, right? So maybe your crop yields go down from like 100% down to like 80%, 70%, right? In the future due to climate change. Well, I can go in and measure the loss in economic productivity. But then, what does it mean if you have like ocean acidification and you lose biodiversity in like a coral reef, right? Some people will try and measure like, oh, like how much tourism would you lose if the Great Barrier Reef were to disappear? And you could maybe have some kind of economic indicator for that. But a lot of people will argue that's not the only like measurable, economic impact. There are like other things that might be much harder to economically measure. And so just kind of keep that in mind when we think about social cost of carbon. Yeah.
Is the social cost of carbon typically equated to an actual economic cost in the sense that human health is up there, and I was just reading a study about electrification and decarbonization averting premature death.
Mm-hmm. That's.
I feel like it's hard to put a monetary value.
Yes. Okay. We don't. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that is one of the things that makes these types of measurements really difficult, for sure. The other thing is like, let's say you're like you're an indigenous people, and there's something about a particular environment that brings you a lot of value. Assessing the sort of economics of that may be really not straightforward, again, because not only is it difficult to determine like your specific value for that thing, like different people may value it in different ways, right? So yeah, this is like economists like to talk about doing carbon pricing and enforcing a carbon tax as kind of like a catch-all solution, but if you really get into the details of these things, it can be a lot less straightforward. And I would certainly argue that the social cost of carbon is not a perfect metric by any means. But okay, I want to get back to what you're saying. So this is known as the value of a statistical life. Yeah. So this makes people feel really uncomfortable. And I did too when I was in grad school, right? There's this idea that there is some kind of monetary value that we put on people's lives. And you say, oh, like, how can we do that? Like, my life is, that is an interesting question. Thank you, Siri. My life is infinitely valuable, right? Like, I would pay any amount of money to stay alive. But in fact, we do have this thing called the value of successful life. And this is actually a real value that even the government uses to put some kind of like monetary worth. And so, okay, I'll talk about this, like how we go about getting to this in a second, but like going back to what you're saying, when we measure economic damages, this definitely plays a strong role in determining some of those damages, because if you can imagine that at higher sort of temperature scenarios, you know, you probably will have higher morbidity and mortality in general, and so we consider this in the sort of economic damages that go into the social cost of carbon calculation. Okay, so even though we may say that we infinitely value our lives, people behave in certain ways that people will behave in certain ways where we can actually measure this with fairly good accuracy. Okay, so how'd you get to school today? You biked. Okay. What do you think the probability is that you'd get hit by a car on your way to school?
I'd say it's low because
Okay, give me a number. Give me a number. One in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, 1 in a million, 1 in 1,000. Okay. So bike accident. 1 in 100. Would you say that is more likely or less likely to happen than if you walk to school? More likely. Okay, so what's the probability that you would get hit by a car? What's the probability that you would get hit by a car? Yeah, walking. What would you say? 1 in 1,000? 1 in 1,000. Okay. All right. Well, how much do you value your life in general? Like just infinite amount. Okay. So if that were true, why didn't you walk? It's safer. It's safer, right? To save time. Okay. So how much would you say your time is worth? Any metric. A lot. $100 an hour? $1,000 an hour? Okay. Well, let's say $100 an hour. Okay. So this takes, let's say biking takes you what? 15 minutes, and let's say walking takes you 30 minutes. You see what I'm getting at here? You are willing to pay some amount to take extra risk, right? By making it faster. So there are all these behaviors that people do, like, do you wear a helmet when you're walking around, like just as a pedestrian, right? You would decrease your risk, right? And if you infinitely value your life, you would do everything in your power to mitigate risk of dying, right? So, okay, this is kind of a, silly example of this, but you can go around society and just like measure people's risk tolerances and how they value certain things, whether it's like this or, maybe it's how much they're willing to pay for certain types of healthcare or, whatever. Oh yeah, oh, for sure. Yeah. But this is why it's called a value of a statistical life. So it's the average monetary value of a life. So plane goes down, crashes, everyone on board dies, family sues the airlines for compensation. The judge awards money based off of values like this that are sort of predetermined, as opposed to, paying one family more money because they're richer, and paying another family less because they're poorer, right? Again, this is like a super uncomfortable topic for a lot of people because we're just like putting this economic value on people's lives. But your behavior in the real world is what's helping us determine the actual quantity of these values. Yeah.
That's a really fascinating video. Fascinating video on YouTube.
Uh-huh.
And how my content is going about the values of life.
Yep.
Because there's this long debate about where some people are like, oh yeah, like if you just like add up the value of all the my body, I'm worth like $200. So I think the YouTube channels called Half as Interesting. Go check it out. Definitely a lot less. I don't know. It makes it not like as like uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Just summing like all the way down to the cost benefit analysis.
Yeah, I mean that's essentially what this type of thing is trying to do. Yeah, well, I think that's partly why it makes people uncomfortable, because it's like you're coming up with this kind of like, well, let's say sort of arbitrary value, but this type of thing actually is very valuable to have, right, for lots of different reasons. If everyone's lives were truly infinite value, you can imagine that it would essentially break down a lot of like economic services. So like, you want to buy car insurance, well, that'll be all of your money, please, right? Like you want you want healthcare from a doctor, that'll be all of your money, please, right? So there has to be some kind of way of putting some kind of objective value based off of the way people sort of behave, and it's important to remember this is like a statistical life. This isn't saying one specific individual, right? People will argue that the productivity of one person's life and all of that, that does go into this equation, but sort of generally over the population, so that you're not basically saying that one life is worth more than another. Yeah.
So just to clarify, the example you're showing is kind of like a revealed preference.
Yes.
But so is it more like a revealed preference?
Yes.
Or is it sort of like a calculation based on how much value someone is expected to generate in a lifetime?
It's a combination of both of those things. Yeah. So, okay. So human health damages, that's like one small aspect of this. And see, even that one subtick of human health is controversial, right? Like, I'm sure people have disagreements about what constitutes a VSL, and and so on and so forth. So social cost of carbon, it's an important thing to think about, but there are a lot of caveats to these things. All right, what is the social cost of carbon these days? Depends on your discount rate, right? We've talked about this during our discount rate lecture, but if I don't care what happens 100 years from now, then all those climate change damages are going to be less meaningful to me. I probably have a higher discount rate, and so so maybe that means like you know, I don't really care that much about the damages, and they're going to be effectively lower today because the discount rates are higher. The sort of typical number that like policymakers and regulators a lot of times use is 3%. Right now it's at $50, $50 per ton of carbon dioxide. And you can see how this changes at different discount rates, and that at different sort of quantiles. At like the 95th percent interval for social cost of carbon is $150. Yeah, so this is determined from these, like this distribution is from these like Monte Carlo simulations of the damages. Any questions? Yeah.
So, are these made by companies that
No. This is the damages that are caused right now. And they'll continue to go up if we don't do anything. The whole point of a carbon tax is like, we need to pay money to pay the externalities associated with whatever we're doing, okay? So that's the carbon tax. And now the question is, okay, let's say you pass a carbon tax. How much should the carbon tax be? You could have it really high, and that would cause economic activity to decrease to some extent, but then it'll improve your carbon emissions. If you have it really low, maybe it'll decrease a little bit, but not do so much for the emissions and associated carbon damages. The social cost of carbon is, the idea here is that's the carbon tax that you would set so that the amount of money that people are paying is equal to the damages that they're causing. Maybe. That's right. How many places around the world have implemented a carbon tax? There's like a few, but not that many. Yeah. This is kind of the big thing that economists will argue for, is to implement a carbon tax. And then if we implement a carbon tax, it probably makes sense to set it at the social cost of carbon.
So what would do with that tax though? I mean, if we have like a value of life, just the value of life, you could argue that people who are with these companies that maybe
Yeah, so so the whole discussion about addressing the externalities revolves around putting a carbon tax in place. There's a whole other set of important discussions about what you do with those taxes. So a carbon tax is regressive, which means that it will impact lower income populations more than it would impact higher income populations. So one of the ideas behind the carbon tax is to just return it back to like lower income populations to balance out the regressivity of it. Other things you could do with the carbon tax is to invest it into like clean technologies. So you have a sort of feedback mechanism that incentivizes clean energy use at the same time that you're sort of penalizing dirty energy use. Yeah, so the sort of disbursement of funds is a really interesting topic. There's a lot of like socio-economic equity and diversity sort of issues affiliated with it. Yeah, and there's a lot that you could do because this would raise quite a lot of money. At the same time, it'd be nice to just have a carbon tax in the first place, which is probably the harder part at this point.
What are some of the arguments against? I mean, besides the companies arguing that, but obviously they don't want to get taxed like this.
Yeah.
Like, do they? Another thing I could imagine them saying, it's going to lower economic activity, and that maybe that has a bigger consequence than.
No, but yeah, but that's the whole point of this, right? Is that we know that enforcing a carbon tax will lead to some economic damages, right? But you're causing all these other damages, and we just want those to balance out. That's the sort of economic argument. There's a whole different set of arguments for whether or not you should have like targeted regulatory policies, which economists will argue are less efficient versus if you should have like a carbon tax. So like, should I have fuel efficiency standards, or should I have a zero emissions vehicle mandate, or a renewable portfolio standard, or a low carbon fuel standard? All these, all of these energy and transportation policies that are trying to decarbonize. Well, an economist will say, no, you shouldn't have any of those things. You should just have this. It's the most efficient way. I'm not gonna get too much into that right now. Maybe we can have that discussion in another class. But there are sort of implementation issues and political issues and sort of policy complexity issues related to those, to all of these things. And so you should kind of pay attention to some of these nuances when you think about that. So what I would say is that I agree in theory that with a lot of economists that just having a carbon tax would probably be sort of efficient and beneficial in many ways. But I think in practice, having a lot of these other like regulatory mechanisms is probably just as, if not more, impactful than a carbon tax. You need to like look around for any economists who are gonna like flay me alive for saying that. Okay. So the share of the social cost by country. So this is like a kind of a complicated diagram here, but let me see if I can walk you guys through it. So, so if you go from left to right, that is the share of global emissions. Okay. So guys on the left side don't emit that much. Guys on the right side emit a lot more. Share of the social cost of carbon. So going from the bottom up to the top, you can think of this as kind of sort of the percentage of the percentage of the economic damages. And then this is the same thing, but scaled to population, so like per capita. So the darker the red it is, the more we essentially emit per capita. And then the size of the dot represents the size of the economy of that country. So like it's a 4-dimensional graph. There's a lot of axes to think about. But you can see, right, like US per capita, they emit a lot. economy's big and they have a relatively large share of global emissions. China is pretty big, but per capita, it's lower than compared to, say, the US. And then you can kind of zoom in here if you want to get a little bit more detailed on how these guys are doing. And note, this is like a log scale for the size. Okay, so that's kind of the high level view of the social cost by country. And the main takeaway here is that, right, and maybe this is super obvious, but different countries will contribute sort of different amounts to essentially share of global emissions and climate change. This contributes to some of the difficulties in, some of the large climate agreements, in the like Paris Climate Accords and that sort of thing. Like, to what degree should a specific country going to be held responsible for climate change? There are a bajillion different metrics you could do this with. And obviously, if I'm the US, I'm going to say, oh, we, sort of disregarding, even some of the simple stuff that probably wouldn't make sense, just like pure population or something. You would probably want to pick the sort of dimension that you have to pay the least in, right? That can be one of the contributing factors to what makes like global cooperation on this topic really, really challenging. Okay, cost benefit integrated assessment models. Okay, so we'll kind of go through these a little bit quicker. So the DICE model, there are all these resources that get optimized into sort of your social set of modeling aspects. So this is like human-based factors of like production, and then these get fed into climate change models, which we don't really delve into, and then you can have this kind of recursion element that helps you determine what the climate damages are as you have sort of different inputs into each of your resource factors. Page model, similar type of thing. You have all of the stuff in your economic modeling here. So strength of economy, size of population, they do have things like equity weighting in here. Again, this is a really sort of high level examination of these models. And then this all gets interacted with a climate model here. And this can help you figure out what your damages are and what are the sort of adaptation costs. You can imagine that these things can look really different, okay? Incremental damages here, compared to this, right? It's not, I don't think it's a huge surprise that like different models are going to come up with sort of slightly different results. But the main idea is that I have some kind of banding in terms of uncertainty, right? These aren't even off by like an order of magnitude. These are off by, 4x, 3x type of thing. So we have this sort of estimated range of the damages. This is where you would want to think about things that wouldn't be captured, things like, maybe the VSL is lower than I would like, or there are like biodiversity things that wouldn't be included in here, or the way that like certain populations value certain types of things, right? That probably means that you're doing underestimates of a lot of the damages, and kind of to what degree will those, be sort of in the same order of magnitude, or would it make it 10 times higher, 100 times higher, right? But people try to think pretty carefully about these things. Okay, and so estimating these damages essentially allows us to figure out what the social costs of carbon are. There are other things that we care about other than just looking at the damages. We can use process-based integration assessment model or integrated assessment models. So instead of doing this cost benefit, we do a process-based so that I can do things like model interventions. So what happens if the government pushes these policies that like make it so that you have to have 100% EVs on the road by 2030, right? The cost-based models aren't going to do a really good job at doing this, but if you have this, you can try and you can essentially create this model that has a bunch of levers that you can mess around with. Okay, there are highly aggregated models for the cost-based ones. And they have a lot of assumptions to give the approximate value of everything in the model, but the process-based gives a lot more detailed results. But these things can start to get really complicated. So this is kind of the basic set of things. So you have all of your input assumptions. It goes through some kind of modeling cycle here. You can have human factors, economy, energy system that feed into your environmental factors, land system, climate, and then you get a bunch of outcomes here. So I'll quickly cover some of the high resolution integrated assessment models, AIM, GCAM, image, message. So these are all integrated assessment models that have been employed, for example, in the IPCC reports. The home institutions are here. But again, as I was saying, a lot of these are sort of large interagency and multi-university efforts. Have people heard of these models at all? No. Okay. This is the image model. So the two aspects, right, are the sort of economic modeling and the environmental modeling. So you have kind of larger scale Earth system models. And then in the world of integrated assessment models, image is probably sort of more on the higher complexity for the environment, but a little bit simpler in the sort of economics aspect. This kind of overlaps a lot with many other integrated assessment models, but identify response strategies to global environmental change, indicate key interlinkages and understand uncertainty, and then how the future unfolds, right? That's why you want to include a lot of uncertainty as much as possible, because there are lots of different outcomes that could happen. And then how you can prevent unwanted impacts, which is kind of why we're using these process-based models, is to be able to integrate information here to change specific outcomes. This is the whole sort of schema for image. So it measures a whole bunch of environmental issues, climate change, land use change, biodiversity loss, and so on. But also includes aspects of economic growth and wealth, anthropogenic emissions, as well as natural emission sources, and it can integrate policy changes. So just to like show a quick example of this, like if I were to dive into some of the modeling inputs, right? So these are things that some of these things we've talked about. So things like learning rate, technology development. Here we have market shares, right? So private consumption, lifestyle parameters, energy intensity, energy efficiency, all of these things are topics of modeling that we have talked about in this class, right? And you can see how that kind of integrates into this much larger system. Yeah, technology costs here. And then in terms of, so those are all inputs, and then in terms of the modeling, right, thinking about energy demand, how that relates to energy consumption, you have demand for electricity and other fuel resources, and how that relates to energy supply. So you can imagine that like each of these boxes might be in itself some kind of module or submodel for this much larger system. GCAM, another well-known integrated assessment model. This one runs in 5-year time series, and it links the economic sector with energy sector, land use, water, and earth systems. More complex energy system diagrams we got going on here. You can see what things that particular models are kind of going to focus on in the energy system, right? Transportation, buildings, industry. So a lot of, let's say a lot of what we do is going to be sort of in this sort of upper energy system area, and then some in the economic sector, but we don't really talk too much about agricultural technologies and land characteristics. You can imagine that like the level of specialization that would go into each of these things. That's why the teams related to the development of these integrated assessment models are so sort of widespread, and they talk to, to get at energy demand just for transportation, you might talk to a bunch of transportation experts. You might bring in people to help develop, just that sort of subset of the sort of larger modeling effort. And so these things are not like built by, one person. If you want to do a good job, you want to get it as much sort of expertise across all of these sectors as possible. Yeah, and so as I was saying, like we had this focus in the energy system, and so this is kind of like a dive into what it might look like here for like electricity power generation, right? You have all of these resources. It goes all the way to the primary energy source, and it looks at all of these different fuel markets and how they satisfy end use demands. So GCAM is one of the 4 models used for representative concentration pathways, RCP, for the IPCC. They participated in every climate assessment in the last sort of 20 years. There's the Energy Modeling Forum, as well as the IPCC. Yeah, and so they're involved with a lot of efforts looking at climate change impacts and interventions. And there are literally, hundreds of publications based off of these models every year. Yeah, and so the IPCC, actually here, let me jump forward really quick. So the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So who has heard of the IPCC? Yeah, okay, great. So this is a body developed by the United Nations dedicated to looking at an objective, scientific-based way of evaluating human-based climate change. So it takes a look at nature, political, and economic impacts. First established in 1988, and thousands of scientists and experts contribute on a voluntary basis, sort of across the world. Major groups in the IPCC, so there's 3 working groups. Working group 3 looks at scientific aspects of the climate system and climate change. Working Group 2 looks at social, economic, and natural systems. And Working Group 3 looks at options for mitigation and adaptation in climate change to basically, how can we reduce, what are the potential avenues to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the future. The IPCC regularly releases assessment reports that basically reviews the latest climate science and updates a lot of the sort of impacts as we get more and more information. The first one was published in 1990. The last one was published in 2014. AR6, which is the assessment report number 6. I think Working Group 1 and 2 have already released their reports, and then Working Group 3 were releasing that in hopefully sometime this year. Yeah. So one of the big things that they do is they look at these greenhouse gas pathways. So representative concentration pathways, 2.6 to 8.5. This is an indication of the increase in radiative forcing due to climate change. So this is, if you remember, the average solar insolation is about 300 watts per meter squared on the surface. And so how much what pathway would increase that by 2.6 watts all the way up to 8.5 watts per meter squared? And that's eventually what's leading to your sort of temperature increases. And so these major scenarios can be evaluated in a lot of the integrated assessment models to look at how do we get there, what sorts of levers need to happen to, say, reduce from RCP 8.5 down to a lower sort of RCP. This talks about socioeconomic challenges for mitigation and socioeconomic challenges for adaptation. Does everyone know what the difference between mitigation and adaptation is? Can anyone help me out here? Yeah, so mitigation. So we talk about these two things for a couple of reasons. So mitigation are ways we can reduce greenhouse gases. So this might be doing things like electrifying vehicles, improving energy efficiency, and so on and so forth. And that will help reduce future damages from climate change. Adaptation is this idea that we think that climate change is inevitable to some extent. And so this would be like building like levees around cities to deal with sea level rise, right? Yeah, fireproofing, right? Things to deal with like the higher frequency of hurricanes in the Gulf Coast. All of those measures are adaptation measures. And both of these require like costs, right? They're incurring costs to society if you're switching to more expensive energy efficiency technologies, or if you're trying to, do things like fireproofing to prevent things like higher incidences of fires. So this is kind of this common conditions that they think about across different integrated assessment models. And there are different, essentially, scenarios that we can take. You know, some where you want to do lots of mitigation, but you also have to do lots of adaptation versus intermediate in both. So there's this kind of scale of these things. What do the integrated assessment models tell us about energy consumption? So this is our current energy consumption, and this is broken down by primary fuel types today. And if I want to have this SSP1, which is sort of the lowest, right, then the consumption has to stay sort of fairly low out into the future. And so these are all sort of breakdowns of different integrated assessment models that provide us information on what the future will look like across all of these different scenarios. And obviously they're not going to be all the same. You know, you can have pretty big differences sometimes between scenarios, but roughly speaking, there's a lot of consistency between these really sort of different models, which is nice. Okay. So we'll close out today talking about, all right, you know, how are we kind of contributing to society, making these dinky little models, right, in this class or in my research. So we have sort of system level models. These can help inform, even at a sectoral level, the way that integrated assessment models are put together. So even if I kind of develop this like transportation model that doesn't end up getting used in like a larger scale integrated assessment, like some of the results and findings can influence the way other models might be structured, the way that integrated assessment models start thinking about, you know, the way sectoral models are operating. And so a lot, you have sort of joint agreements or maybe disagreements about potential outcomes and futures in the IPCC, or maybe in other larger scale reports. There's like the National Climate Assessment, Energy Modeling Forum, a lot of avenues for integrated assessment models to work, right? And so the idea is hopefully this influences policymakers in some way, and then you have some concrete impacts. This doesn't always happen, but I guess we're doing our best here. So, okay. Yeah, and the other avenue is to help influence the public, right? Because it's actually pretty fascinating. As the IPCC has continued to release reports on climate change over the years, public engagement has been increasing basically every time, and that's kind of heartening, right? Even if this isn't happening to the extent that is needed, sometimes the public can help as well. Okay, and so that's it for today.